A lot of the time when I complete a game, particularly when it's a game I like, there's almost a sense of disappointment. Disappointment that the game is over, there's a finality to it that kind of gets to me. This isn't always the case for various reasons, but I've come to realize that if it's a horror game, it's almost the opposite. It's not disappointment, it's relief. In Dead Space's case, there is that sense of, aw man, this was good, I wish it wasn't over, but that's combated by the relieving phew, that nightmare is over. I think that is the mark of a successful horror game. The overwhelming feeling of dread that exudes throughout the atmosphere, the few and far between moments of reprieve, the knowledge that even though you just dealt with a room of monsters, there will be more upcoming. Throughout a game like that, it continues to build up, and because these games typically exist entirely within their horror setting, the real reprieve can only exist at the end. Completing the game becomes a cathartic experience, a weight off your shoulders. There's more to achieving that effect than having things chase you, there's more than just having monsters, and more than just turning off lights. Those things are typically important elements for horror, they are things we as people often find scary in reality, but it takes more than just having them to succeed, otherwise you end up being Outlast. And since I'm bringing that up, limiting player ability is also an aspect of horror games often used, and something I really liked in Amnesia or Soma, but considering I'm about to praise Dead Space, obviously making your player incapable is not a requirement. While all of these elements and more can be used to great effect, I would say that there are three key details to a horror game: atmosphere, relentlessness, and unpredictability. Perhaps these are a general idea, but at the very least I believe these are where Dead Space succeeds. If you nail atmosphere, almost all of those other elements can come or go. Though since I did mention lights, obviously lighting plays a huge role in atmosphere, and Dead Space is no different in that regard. Setting is probably the first thing that comes to mind when you're establishing horror work. There are your creepy staples like a hospital or mental institution, your isolated ones like a cabin, haunted or decrepit locations like abandoned buildings, or your subversions of locations typically associated with a happier or lighter thing like a school or amusement park. Granted, there are many types of horror, and with enough skill and craft, you could probably make an effective horror movie or game that doesn't require a specific setting. Our setting is an isolated spaceship, all alone, like a more extreme version of a cabin in the woods. While it's a start, atmosphere is more than just setting. Something I particularly like about the design of the Ishimura is that it's a mining ship. It's mechanical, built for purpose. There's no, or little, luxuriousness to it. It isn't designed to look like a horror setting, which is something that can potentially take me out of a game, but it's not a comforting locale. It's industrial, cold, cramped, so before you even start adapting it to horror, there's already an unwelcoming aspect. The disarray helps, it's derelict now, so right from the get-go, there lacks that sense of ease. There are holes, uncleanliness, fires, fidgeting lights and screens. Obviously that's because what kicks off the actual horror part has begun, but I think the ship itself being unwelcoming first makes it more effective. There's a hollow-sounding computer voice rattling off the various issues with the ship, and the would-be staff are barely to be seen. Now, in terms of atmosphere, I feel like a lot of this is probably obvious, but that doesn't make it unimportant or not worth pointing out, because it is also just executed very well. The visuals are excellent, and I think the nature of the ship feeling like it was genuinely constructed for its purpose helps that. Aside from the fact that I'm not sure a ship with what is probably thousands of people should only operate with a single-track tram, but hey, maybe they have another system in place that we don't see. Another aspect of that atmosphere, the impending doom, is the further you get in the game, the more you see of the ship exposed to the fleshy organism growing on the walls. Even though the ship is already not welcoming in its current state, you begin to feel even more separated from anything safe as the life form has molded the ship into something unrecognizable. Nothing but the sound of your footsteps, the pitter-patter of the creatures in the vents, and the vents themselves starting to malfunction. They ramp up and escalate along with your heart rate, unsure if something's going to break out of the shaft at the end or perhaps from somewhere else as the noise of the fans crowd out all the other sound. The use of sound in the game is superb, which includes moments spent in a vacuum where the audio is limited. There are times where you can choose to turn off lights or turn off the air, leaving you in an area with little light or little sound. A muffled deafness where you're forced to look all around you lest there's something coming from behind. The Ishimura is riddled with destruction, corpses, distant screeches, the trembling voices of staff in recordings, and every moment is a descent into madness. Additionally, you're frequently visited by hushed voices, unsure if they're in Isaac's head or just echoing throughout the ship. You reach an open room or a corridor, and you don't want to walk forward, as you know something will be there. And something will be there, at least most of the time. You know it, I know it, the game knows it, the whole world knows it, and the monster waiting to pop out especially knows it. Do not relent. If you want to instill horror, you can't stop. Sure, you can have your moments here and there of some light reprieve, a tram station, an area with a shop or a bench. You're able to typically assume that there will not be any trouble. But the game needs to keep the pace, upping the ante continuously so that you know that your only real out is the end of the game. That light is at the end of the tunnel. Anyone playing knows that the game isn't infinite, so you don't need to give your players too many breaks. I think that unrelenting is what contributes most to the feeling of relief when beating the game. The recent Doom games are good for this too. They aren't horror in the sense that you're meant to be afraid. In fact, the opposite is true regarding the character you play as and the demons you kill, but the atmosphere in Doom and its constant flinging into tough circumstances to the point of exhaustion achieves a similar stress. Dead Space is broken up into 12 chapters, and there are times where you feel like you have a second to breathe when finishing one. Like I said, you'll come into an area with a shop and a save point, maybe a bench nearby, or even in the same room, and you can feel like you can just sit here and relax. Sometimes, mind you, as later in the game, even those areas can be housing enemies as you enter, expecting safety. They can be dispatched quickly usually, but that idea still looms. You enter a shop only to realize you just heard the break-in of a necromorph, and you frantically close it in hopes you can deal with it before it arrives. In fact, finishing a checkpoint or a whole chapter, you learn that all that means is that some more scripts have just kicked in for enemies. Back from where you came, or farther ahead? Possibly both. Definitely both. I think the best aspect of Relentlessness in Dead Space is the Hunter, which is unkillable until the end of the game. There are a handful of confrontations, and in each one you're running around trying to figure out what you're meant to do to deal with it. It's quite literally an unrelenting force, and the game itself continuously dispatching it to kill you enforces that well. There were instances where it's after you among a handful of other necromorphs, and while dealing with those, there's a constant thought of, oh god, where's the Hunter? I almost wish that they made it so the Hunter had a chance to randomly locate you throughout the game to really nail that home. Almost. By the end of the game, the combination of atmosphere and relentlessness created an almost oppressive feeling. I would take breaks playing despite enjoying my time because I just needed to get out of the world. Entering a new area was just as concerning as it was exciting, which is funny because it's not like you would be surprised to reach another room where you fight monsters. That's what the game is. It's not an impressive prediction to suggest that there will be more as you continue the game. Having said that, unpredictability is still there and is another important aspect when creating a horror experience. Yes, you can assume that as you keep playing through Dead Space, you'll find more corridors with a couple necromorphs blocking your path, or a big open room with a gauntlet-style fight. That's the gameplay. But what's important is that you do not truly know when or where. While atmosphere is your overall tone and feel of the game and its setting, and relentlessness is its insistence that the atmosphere keeps pulling you down lower and lower, unpredictability is what enhances both. The lights are off. Are you going to need to turn some on? Are you going to need to aim your gun to use the flashlight? Maybe nothing will pop out. Are you in a vacuum? Better keep watching your back. There might be something there. Maybe not. That's a big open room. Are you going to have to fight? Sometimes you don't. Sometimes you do. But where are they going to come from? The ceiling? The floor? The walls? Now, this sounds like it's just the reality of playing through something you haven't played before. Generally speaking, of course, you're not going to know what a new area is necessarily going to give you. But typically games teach players to notice patterns. If it always goes 1, 2, 3, then every time you see 1 and 2, you'll naturally suspect 3 is on its way. This is a fair and understandable thing to do in most games. Pattern recognition rewards a player, and it keeps things from feeling unfair. However, in a horror game, playing with that notion is important. Subverting the expectation that 3 is coming keeps you on your toes. It sure might be, but it might be something else. It could be nothing. It wouldn't make a very interesting horror game if you saw every single scary part spelled out for you, or I suppose counted out in this case. A horror movie will have a camera panning around a dark room with no movement, with a crescendo that pulls you into climax with a jump, but sometimes it cuts instead. Knowing something is coming doesn't necessarily eliminate the fear so long as there's a chance that it doesn't. That's essentially the entire game. Part of that reluctance to move forward is because you aren't really sure. You know it's coming, it's out there somewhere, but the when and where makes you paranoid. This also goes back to the last section where I mentioned what are typically your safe havens. You're guaranteed to be safe there, except the times where you're not, and it's important to not know when. An unfortunate aspect of this being a video game does mean that some gameplay elements can get in the way of that. Not majorly, but when you reach a room that has a ton of ammunition and a station to recharge your stasis, you can be certain to 99% that you're indeed about to fight. I mean, there it is. It's just not where I expected it. But thankfully, moments like that are few and far between enough that it doesn't break the unpredictability. The last chunk of the game is a slew of encounters topped off with a boss fight that, while I don't know necessarily fits the game all that well in terms of gameplay, allows for one last onslaught of adrenaline. This serves well as a release of the tension that is built and ached to be cut throughout the game. The final cutscene plays and you are flushed with relief. That cathartic feeling works well because it is likely what the character's feeling too. You went through the same nightmare Isaac did, and unlike some other games where you're disappointed there isn't more, it's easy to lump yourself in with him and be thankful that that horror is over. Sort of. This is speaking thematically, of course, as I would love to have more of the game to play. Like I said, often when I complete a game I liked, I just wish there were more, and in some cases I almost get this let down feeling. Not to the fault of the game or any other game, perhaps it's just a personal thing, but there's a sense of finality that's almost uncomfortable to me. Some games will leave me sad because of its narrative, or because I want to keep playing it, even for ones that do have some relief like Doom, but a good horror game is one where I can say, that's better upon completing it. That's probably the mark of a successful horror title. Dead Space is a great game. It's probably one of the best remakes out there, and it's a lot of fun. The guns are varied and satisfying to use, there's a decent amount of tools at your disposal to keep the game from feeling stale, and that means the horror elements can shine. All three of those aspects can be done very well, but if the game isn't fun to play, then it can definitely make them feel underwhelming in the end. Thankfully, Dead Space's atmosphere is able to envelop you, and its relentlessness closes the lid and pulls you down to the bottom, where the unpredictability can build up that stress and keep you disoriented. While I don't think the story is exactly great, it's competent enough not to take away from these elements. In fact, religious cult mixed with cosmic horror works pretty well. I'm really hoping they continue with either a remake of the second game or a brand new sequel of their own, particularly that one, because I'd love to see what they could offer with some new ideas. I'll wholeheartedly accept either option, though it's just a bummer it'll probably be years from now. As always, thanks for watching everyone, and I will see you in the next one.